The Kansas City Chiefs may be the kings of the AFC West, but you need to look at their divisional rivals to find my favorite fantasy football sleepers. Today we wrap up the AFC by diving deep into the AFC West on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you'll find all of my rankings, both dynasty and rookie rankings, on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I also do a heap of articles over at Razball as well, so I recommend you heading over there for lots of awesome fantasy football content. Today we're talking about the AFC West, and look, I'm a big Chiefs fan. And so, I'm always happy to talk about this division. But I got to say, the Chiefs aren't my favorite fantasy football people at the moment. There's a lot of sleepers in these other divisions that I think are going to be really interesting for fantasy football. So let's rip right into it. We're going to start things off talking about the Denver Broncos.
The Denver Broncos select Bo Nix.
There it is.
Quarterback, Oregon.
Going to gather, unleashes towards the end zone. It is deflected in the air, and it's caught. Brandon Johnson.
Ray Mims, the rookie, is taking it in for a kick return of 99 yards.
To McLaughlin at the 15, up ahead, and he's still going for a touchdown. Wilson over the middle, caught, touchdown. Cortland Sutton.
Now, Sean Payton's first year in charge of the Broncos wasn't as bad as many people are saying. In fact, it was their best year in quite some time. Russell Wilson played better than most expected, and that whole breakdown with him was a little bit of a surprise for me because I thought things should go well if they can get him embedded in their system a little bit better. Instead, they've gone back to the drawing board and they've gone to Bo Nix, so I think it's going to be an interesting choice. Their scoring wasn't really their problem last season. They really struggled on defense. They conceded the 6th most points on defense, and yet they've gone out and spent their only pick in the first 2 rounds on a quarterback. Is that sensible? Well, when you're still paying Russell Wilson $50 million a year, not particularly. And that's why they've got the highest dead cap in the whole league. They also don't have a lot of cap space either, despite that. So I think they're in a little bit of a pickle, and I think they're going to struggle a little bit this year. And it didn't need to be this way. They could have done things so differently and ended up in a really good situation. So that's not a fantasy football issue. Let's talk about the fantasy football changes they have made, and they've made a heap of them. They've brought in a new quarterback. They've brought in a new running back. They've got a pair of good wide receivers, and realistically, all they've lost is a good starting quarterback for fantasy and a solid wide receiver who should have been a bit better in Jerry Jeudy. Are they sensible changes to make? Well, they've paid a lot of money to guys who didn't really deserve big contracts. But the biggest issue is they're paying a heap of money to guys who aren't even on the team. And that's going to really limit their production and hurt a lot of their fantasy football assets. I know guys like Cortland Sutton have been sleeper picks in the last few years. And I know a lot of people are in love with Troy Franklin this year. I'm not on that train as well. And if you hang around, I'll tell you why. But let's start with the quarterbacks. Now, realistically, week 1, I don't know who's going to be the quarterback here. A lot of people are saying Zach Wilson. I don't think so. I think it's probably Jarrett Stidham or Bo Nix. It's possible that they just give it to Nix straight away. He has done, 6 years in college, so he should be ready for the NFL by now. It's just going to be about whether he can get his head around the system. And I think realistically, that should be his strength. He is a smart quarterback. I just don't know that he has the arm talent for the NFL. He was very good at Oregon, but he struggled earlier at Auburn. And I think realistically, if you look at most of the guys who come into the NFL after 3 or 4 years, you expect them to be a little bit better than that. He comes in further progressed, but does he have the upside of a lot of these other guys? Well, probably not. I don't think he's going to be able to do anything more than be a solid game manager. And while Sean Payton does have a history of going okay with solid game managers, I think that if he's going to win a Super Bowl or even make the playoffs, he's going to need a little bit more than any of the quarterbacks on this roster. It wouldn't surprise me if all of these guys aren't in a starting role by this time next year. And that makes me really wary of putting any of them on my fantasy team. I know that there's a temptation to go for Bo Nix over a Michael Penix, for example. But you've got to think 3 or 4 years down the road and think, am I trying to get average production this year at the expense of good future production? I don't think that that's a trade I'm willing to make. I'd rather leave Knicks for somebody else, and I'd rather go elsewhere because realistically, there's no one in this quarterback room that I want, even in Superflex. Realistically, the running back room's a little bit more interesting. We know they're probably going to run quite a bit because that's what bad teams do. I expect that they're probably going to lean on Javonte Williams, but only to a certain extent. We saw last year they really tried to mix it up a lot. And I expect this year you're probably going to see Williams get 50 to 60% of the snaps, and you're going to see a whole big mix of everyone else after that. I've got Audric Esteem as the next guy up. I think he's actually a pretty solid running back, but fifth-round running backs don't exactly have the greatest of hit rates. So while I'm willing to take a shot on him, I think the upside is pretty low, and it wouldn't surprise me if he started the year as number 4 on the depth chart. I'd say things probably look pretty much the same early on with Samaje Perine doing the third down work, Jaleel McLaughlin coming in and doing some change of pace work, and you probably see a little bit of the rookie coming in initially and then having some sort of role build. Now, what role he ends up stepping into, I don't know. I'm really hoping it's not Williams' role because I think he's definitely the most talented of the backs in this backfield. He didn't look at his best last year, but he was coming off a serious injury, and it was always going to take him time to get back into it. Towards the end of last year, they actually started to use him as more of an every down back, and I think he was more productive in that role. I'm hoping that they can understand that his lack of production was partly down to injury and partly down to pretty mediocre O-line play and average play calling. The play calling's not going to change, but at least his health has changed. So I'm hoping they give him another opportunity, but it is possible that this just becomes a very ugly committee where you don't want any piece of this. If I'm going to take a shot on someone, it's Williams, because I suspect there's going to be people out there who are willing to sell him cheap. Now, the wide receiver room is even uglier. I know Cortland Sutton's the number 1, and he's had some good seasons, but that was a while ago. He wasn't particularly productive last year, despite managing to stay healthy basically the whole time. He was getting the ball in good situations and wasn't really doing much with it. He got a lot of touchdowns. 10 touchdowns is a lot for a guy that finishes that low in fantasy. That is going to regress in the wrong direction. I don't particularly want any part of Cortland Sutton at any price because people are seeing a wide receiver 1 and they're willing to pay that sort of price when realistically you shouldn't be. There are better wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3s on other teams that are going to give you better production. Troy Franklin is the second guy for me in fantasy because he does have upside and he's got good chemistry with Bo Nix. But I think starting the year, he's probably not even going to be one of the starters. I suspect you're probably going to see Marvin Mims on the outside on one side with Cortland Sutton on the other and traveling to the to the slot occasionally. I'd say that Josh Reynolds is the initial slot guy, and then Franklin starts to come in a little bit later on and get some more touches elsewhere. Franklin's mostly an outside receiver, so I think you're probably going to see him take over one of those roles in the long term. But is he going to be productive long term? I'm not sure that he's really that good. There's no particularly good reason that he fell in the draft, according to Charlie Campbell, who I go to for all of my why did someone fall in the draft questions. I just don't think that Franklin quite has the talent of a lot of the other receivers in this class, and that's why he's going so much later. I'd rather take a shot on someone else. He essentially has the value of a very late third-round pick, and even though that's better than a fourth-round pick, it's not someone I want to be putting all my chips in on. So realistically, I'm easing back on all of these guys. I think people are generally overpaying on Franklin, and I think there's leagues out there when Marvin Mims is pretty much free. I think that he has nearly as much upside as Franklin. He was an earlier pick. I think it's possible that he ends up being the guy to own in this situation. Because he's cheaper, he's the guy I'd rather have. I'd basically take whichever one is cheaper, but if I had the choice, I'd just take none of these guys at all. Speaking of not wanting any of these guys, this is a tight end room I have no interest in. Last year, when Greg Dulcich was healthy, and that wasn't for much of the year, it was basically Adam Troutman on early downs, then Dulcich comes in for the passing downs, and they basically cycled like that. I expect they're probably going to do something similar along those lines because they did the same thing when Dulcich was injured. They just brought Lucas Krull in and did exactly the same thing. Now, the best case scenario is that Dulcich starts to take over some of those earlier snaps, but we know Sean Payton loves Adam Troutman. So really the only way you can see Greg Dulcich getting a number 1 role in this team is either if he plays really well and earns it, if Payton leaves, or if he leaves and goes somewhere else. I don't think he's good enough to demand a number 1 spot with most teams because he's not even good enough to demand a number 1 spot on this team. I think this is going to be an ugly situation. I have no interest in any of these guys. Now, a team where I do want the tight ends is the Kansas City Chiefs.
Mahomes with Forever's got a long way to go. Got 10, got 20, got the first down.
Kelsey again, Surtain is there, and at a certain point, how do you stop him? How do you stop him?
Give it to Pacheco, and Pacheco turns on the speed.
It's Rice for the touchdown.
I guess at this point I take it for granted, but I know we're in every single game I've ever played in with him. No matter what the score is, no matter how much time is left, that guy's got magic in his right arm.
McKinnon is in at running back. First down and goal to go. Play action fake. Right side throw. Touchdown! Kansas City! There is a back-to-back Super Bowl champion.
Now, the Chiefs have been nothing short of sensational over the last half of the decade. 3 Super Bowl wins, 1 Super Bowl loss. They make the playoffs every single year. They're basically the team to beat every single time. And they do it without that much talent on their roster. They just seem to be able to make it work. It's excellent coaching. It's smart scheming. It's bringing in the right guys and making the most of them. Now, having Patrick Mahomes makes a big difference. But realistically, the rest of this roster, it's not the greatest. They just seem to be able to make it work. Travis Kelce's an excellent player. They've got a solid O-line now, and they need it because they need to keep Mahomes healthy, because without Mahomes, this team looks far iffier. They've also recognized that, and they've brought in Carson Wentz as a backup quarterback, and I think that's smart. They've also finally fleshed out the wide receiver room, which has been very weak ever since Tyreek Hill left. I think that with Travis Kelce aging, they've recognized they need to replace him somehow, and it's significantly easier to replace him with good wide receivers than trying to find a Kelce-esque tight end who may simply not exist. In fact, realistically, the closest guy you probably get to it is Brock Bowers, who goes to a divisional rival. Now, they did struggle to score points last year, and the defense really stepped up. And when you've got Steve Spagnuolo out there, you know you're going to have a solid defense. And when they give him the right guys, he's able to make it work. We've seen the Chiefs' defense be very good on and off for the last decade or so, and I expect they're going to be solid again this season. But the offense needs to step up and score some more points if they're going to have a better than 11-6 record during the regular season. The playoffs is where they make their money, but for fantasy, we want them to be better in the regular season. Now, they were very, very pass-heavy last season. You expect that with Patrick Mahomes, and I expect that won't change. Jerick McKinnon leaving might mean that we see a lot more of the running back touches come from handoffs rather than checkdowns, but I think realistically, we're still not going to see that much passing in the red zone. They were 4th most in passing touchdown percentage last year. I expect that stays the same. The interesting thing for me is that they've actually got the 3rd youngest roster, and they've got the 2nd least dead cap space, which just shows they're being really sensible in everything they're doing. They also spent their franchise tag this year on Snead and then smartly traded him to another team and got the assets. That's what they do. They just keep bringing in new talented players, and that's why they're so good. The problem is they're not consistently good for fantasy. The only guy you can really rely on for fantasy these days is Patrick Mahomes, and that's because he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Now, is he the best for fantasy? Well, he's a little bit inconsistent. The reason being that he doesn't have the same level of rushing floor as a Hurts or a Jackson or even a Josh Allen, but his passing is so good. He had too many interceptions last year because he didn't have the receivers to go to. The O-line wasn't quite good enough. I expect that takes a step back up this year, and I expect he's going to be a lot better on that front. For that reason, for me, because he's got that longevity, because, even if he ages, as most quarterbacks do, they stop running as much as they did previously, he's still going to be good for fantasy. He doesn't need to run to be good for fantasy. It's just a bonus, and that means you're going to have him being productive for many years to come. He won't always remain a top 5 quarterback, but in Dynasty, he's going to be your number 1 quarterback for quite some time, and that's why I'm willing to take him early in Dynasty startup drafts, and I'm willing to trade for him if I'm looking into the future. Now, would I put him over Josh Allen? Well, if I had 6-point passing touchdowns, I might. I think that's where it becomes really interesting. I do most of my rankings based on the Fantasy Pros standard because obviously I'm in all the Fantasy Pros competitions. For that reason, I have him with 4-point passing touchdowns as my QB2. But if you're in a 6-point passing touchdown league, or probably even a 5-point league, especially if you're thinking longer term, then I think Mahomes is arguably the QB1. He gets a better backup this year in Carson Wentz, and I think that's going to be really helpful for the Chiefs. But that doesn't mean you actually need to bring Wentz onto your roster. He's just there as a useful backup, which gives you a little bit more security with the other pass catching options on the Chiefs. Now, their run game was actually quite effective last year, despite the fact that it was one of the lowest volume running games around. Because they score quite a few points, you expect their running backs to be effective. And I think it's going to be better for Pacheco this year because I think their scoring will improve. They're only 15th last year in points scored. And I do think that they're going to see more handoffs and probably checkdowns as well to Pacheco because we don't currently see Jerick McKinnon on the roster. Now, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a good passing down back, and I suspect he'll be the number 2 option there. But because they've got less backs going around that backfield, that's really going to help both of them get a whole lot more volume. So that means Pacheco becomes a solid starter. For me, he's my running back 10 because I do think he's going to be productive and he's still pretty young. And Edwards-Helaire becomes a valuable handcuff given there's not really anyone else on the roster that can threaten for touches. And if you're wondering who the number 3 guy to get for fantasy is, don't bother. There is no number 3 for fantasy at the moment. They might bring in a veteran, but at the moment I've got Louis Rees-Zammit as my number 3. That's simply because I like reformed rugby players. I used to work for a rugby team as a statistician, so I like supporting those guys when they come into the league. But realistically, he's very much a very, very, very long shot. I also don't think Prince or Ingram's going to be useful. They're all just backup guys, and none of them are likely to get touches unless both of Pacheco and Edwards-Helaire get injured. Now, that might happen, but I think it's unlikely, and I certainly wouldn't be putting my stock in any of these guys because the upside is low, the chances of something happening is low, and you don't know which one to focus on as the number 3. That might become clearer later on, and if we do see a clear number 3 who starts to get a few touches, that might be someone that in a deeper league you can get a share of. Now, the wide receivers is where things get really interesting for the Chiefs. They bring in Xavier Worthy. They've still got Rashee Rice, who's obviously got some suspension question marks. They've brought in Marquise Brown. I think they've been smart in bringing in a lot of talent. They needed to. Travis Kelce isn't going to hang around forever, and their wide receivers were terrible last year. Worthy is my favorite for fantasy, but excuse me, but I'm not convinced he's going to be the number 1 guy in fantasy this year. I think long-term it's going to become his role, but I think Rice will start out as the number 1 as Worthy kind of works his way into that role. He's a good player. He can play in the slot. He can play out wide. He's extremely fast. He's going to be able to take the lid off a little bit. And they've also got Brown, who's a pretty quick player as well. So it kind of gives them options. Worthy's also got reasonable size. So I expect that he'll be used a little bit in the red zone, but realistically, I don't think he's quite where Rice is in the ability to get the same volume of touches. I think he's going to be a little bit more boom bust than Rice, and that's why I prefer Rice initially, and I expect Worthy will probably take over. I do have Worthy listed a little bit lower than a lot of the other rookies. That's just because I think there's a lot of risk with him. For me, he goes into that same category of Brian Thomas Jr. If you saw me talk about the Jags in one of the other videos, you'd know my feelings on him. I just think that we're talking about a guy who's very talented, but there is a significant bust risk there. And when Walter from Walter Football says there's a bust risk, he's so good at analyzing prospects that I trust him. This is a guy that he's very nervous about because he hasn't seen the same ability to play all aspects of the offense. He's more of a speed guy than a guy with talent. We see speed guys bust more than we see guys who are good route runners who are going to get targets bust. So for that reason, I'm a little bit wary of Worthy, but the upside is so huge because we've seen what this offense can do with a really quick player. Hollywood Brown's the interesting one in this offense. He's found it really hard to stay healthy, and when he hasn't exactly been amazing. You'd expect that as the number 1 guy with the Cardinals, he would have been a bit better, and he was just kind of solid. So I'm hoping that he can take a step forward, but I think that he ultimately ends up falling in behind both of these guys. And I expect that we also see guys like Justin Watson and Kadarius Toney get mixed in. Watson will get mixed in on those value snaps where they just really need someone reliable, and Toney will come in on sort of trick plays, and that's going to affect all of these guys getting enough snaps. Until we see a clear number 1 in this offense, I'm wary of really ranking any of these guys particularly high. It's also time to drop guys like Sky Moore, Mecole Hardman. You should never have picked up Justin Ross in the first place. Those guys are all people that you don't need on your roster anymore. They've clearly signaled that they don't rate those guys for the future. It's time to move on. Speaking of moving on, Travis Kelce's pretty close to moving on, but for now, he's still a top 2 tight end in the league, and he's got a top 2 quarterback as well, which definitely helps. I expect that he's probably going to be solid for another year or 2, but realistically, he doesn't have much longer. He's definitely getting into that age where it is harder to consistently produce, especially given the way he plays. There's been a lot of question marks over who's going to take over that role for him, and the answer is nobody. Nobody is going to take over the Travis Kelce role. There is not going to be another Travis Kelce. someone will take over as the starting tight end, and they may be an every down tight end, but they're not going to be Travis Kelce. No one is as good at Travis Kelce as doing all of that sort of stuff. He's one of the best tight ends we've ever seen. They're not going to replace him and give someone else that same role. I expect that Noah Gray is probably the next guy up. I don't really see it in Jared Wiley. I think realistically, the next actual top tight end might be a guy who's not even drafted yet. And I think there's probably a couple of guys in college who could realistically step into a solid top 12 role with them. But I certainly don't see anyone being that top 3 tight end anymore. I think that's probably going to slowly transition across to the wide receivers. And we see what happens generally when Kelce's injured, which is that the guy who backs him up isn't actually that productive and turns out to be a little bit disappointing for fantasy. So don't go spending your money on Noah Gray and Jared Wiley. You can do better. Those guys are backups. And even if they get into the starting role, they're not an Isaiah Likely who works as a handcuff. They're a nobody who's not going to be particularly productive in the future. Let's move on to the Vegas Raiders, who have my favorite young tight ends that we need to talk about.
And this is Gardner Minshew. I'm so fired up to be here, excited for this season, and ready to go win, baby.
He's got Bowers. Touchdown! Brock Bowers.
First possession of the game. Fake to Jacobs. Out to Adams. Nice block he got right there from Parham. And he's in. First down and 10. White. Blocked by Johnson. First down run of 10.
Just get sideways back to the line of scrimmage as Max Crosby.
They're going to push with the tight end and back of the quarterback. And Naden O'Connell has his first NFL touchdown.
Now, the Vegas ownership has made mistake after mistake when it comes to what they do with their embedded coaching staff. They bring good guys in, and then they get rid of them again when it's not actually the best choice for them. They keep building up and getting better, and then starting again and rebuilding. It's really not working. I do hope they stick with Antonio Pierce. I think that he showed some good ability to kind of get the change room together. I think bringing Getsy in is a little bit of a mistake, though. If we look at how Getsy worked with the Bears, well, it was a very, very run-heavy game. They were 31st in passing percentage, but they were playing a lot of snaps. It wasn't particularly smart, given they had a pretty good defense. They were better off just trying to grind out the game if running is what they were going to do. It made them very ineffective. I expect a lot of short to intermediate passes from him, plenty of screen plays. I don't think he's going to be particularly effective for this offense. I think this could be a little bit of a mistake for them again. Get to use a lot of 12 and 21 personnel with the Bears, and I expect he'll do the same thing with the Raiders. Expect a lot of heavy sets so they can get the ball to their running backs and grind it out that way, because realistically, they don't have the quarterbacks to be in a pass-heavy offense. I'd expect an outside zone run game in some sort of West Coast offense this year. Now, whenever you've got a defensive-minded head coach, you expect that sort of thing. I think the Getsy will have to dial back the play speed, and they're not going to be particularly effective in offense, which is going to make it very difficult to have fantasy-relevant players. But I think there will be a couple. They struggled to score points last year, but I don't think it was due to a lack of talent. I think it was simply because of the way that the plays were being called and that the way that everything was working with them. I expect they will step up a little bit this year. Their defense is pretty solid, so they can kind of get away with not being particularly high scoring. I expect the play rate will increase from 30th this year, though. They've also got a lot of cap space, so they can bring in more talent if they do find that they are starting to challenge or if they have injuries. You can see where they're spending their money, and it's mostly on the D-line, a little bit on the O-line and the wide receivers, which is a smart place to be spending money, especially when you're being cheap on quarterbacks. But I don't think it's going to be enough to see them win in the near future. You can see a lot of guys that have moved out the door are guys that they really should be moving on from. The problem is they've lost Josh Jacobs. I don't think they've really replaced him with an equally talented guy. I think they're going to remain that sort of 6 to 8 win team, and they're going to struggle to get over the hump at least for another year or two until they start making better decisions around their coaching staff, actually let them rebuild properly, and then go from there. Let's talk about the quarterbacks. Don't know how to feel about this quarterback competition. I expect that Gardner Minshew is probably going to be the guy they start off with, and I think he's probably going to be the starter out the gate, no matter what we get told up until that point. I do think that they're probably expecting it to be him early on, but I think possibly if they get into a situation where they're pretty much out of playoff contention, probably becomes Aiden O'Connell's job to lose. I think then after he struggles, we probably see them draft another quarterback next year. I think realistically, they probably thought about doing it this year, and the right guys just didn't fall to them. So they took a little bit of a longer look at things. I think that was a smart idea. Minshew has been solid for fantasy. He does tend to air the ball out enough, although he passes a little bit shorter than your average quarterback, and he is good in those short area spaces. O'Connell was actually the better passer of the two last year, but I think he had slightly better opportunities. He's a lot better at longer passes, and I think that's going to help guys like Adams and Myers get better production when he inevitably comes into the starting role. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens before that actually occurs. Minshew also offers you a little bit more for fantasy because he's a little bit more effective on the ground, and he's slightly more willing to be a bit aggressive. Neither of these guys are really lighting me up for fantasy, though. I think if you're in a super flex league, you kind of got to take your shot on one of them, and Minshew's the guy I'd start off with. But realistically, I think it probably goes over to O'Connell at some stage during the season. Now, the running back room is really where the value is with the Raiders. The running backs and the tight ends, because for the most part, this isn't going to be a very high-scoring offense, and it's going to be a very run-heavy offense. And that makes Zamir White very valuable. To me, he's the clear number one guy. We saw that Alexander Mattison couldn't even beat out guys like Ty Chandler, and they ultimately brought in Aaron Jones to replace him, despite the fact that Aaron Jones is significantly older. So to me, Mattison is the clear backup running back. Zamir White will be the early down guy, and I think he'll probably do a little bit of passing down work. I think they'll want to see if he can handle that, but realistically, they're going to continue to have a passing down guy, and to me, that's probably going to be Dylan Laube, who is their 6th round pick. I think he's a pretty talented receiving back. I mean, look at that. You don't see many running backs in college with 68 receptions and over 700 receiving yards. That is very unusual. For the most part, even good receiving backs in college will really only be getting about 30 for 300 or something along those lines. So I expect that they'll be using Laube in that role. I think they're probably moving on for Amir Abdullah. It might not happen week 1, but I think by halfway through the season, we'll see that it's White and Laube with Mattison simply in there to give White a rest on those early downs. The only time you'd want Mattison is if White gets injured. And even then, it wouldn't surprise me if they use a little bit of Laube and Abdullah as well, because I really don't think Mattison quite has it. He has been very poor at getting consistent yardage over the years in a good running game in Minnesota. Despite the fact this should be a solid running game, he's not someone I want to rely on. I much prefer Zamir White. Now, if you're playing in a non-PPR or a half PPR league, White goes up even more because most of his work will be done on the ground. I expect a far better touchdown total during the season as well. I think he's a guy that I'm really interested in because you can get him so cheap. Now, the wide receiver room continues to be dominated by Devontae Adams. You'll see a little bit of Jacoby Myers, but I'm not particularly interested in him. He's consistent when he manages to stay healthy. He's mostly their slot guy, and I think that'll probably remain that way. But I think it's mainly going to be Adams, Bowers, and Laube as the main passing options, with Myers having a couple of boom games here and there. Realistically, he's probably actually better for best ball than anything else. Devontae Adams is useful if you're trying to win now, but because they're going to probably have very low pass volume based on average plays per game and very low passing percentage, I think he's not someone that you're really going to be able to rely on in the near term. And that makes it scary because he only really has a near term. He's in his 30s. He's going to be out of the league within a couple of years. If you've got him, you need to win now. There are going to be people that are willing to buy him on name value. And if you can sell him for that, that's a good option. You can probably do better. But there are also going to be people who are panicking and are willing to sell him cheap, especially if he has a slow start to the season. So it's a really good idea to get a good understanding of how the people in your league view Adams. There are going to be some both buy low and sell high opportunities based on how smart your league is around valuing players. Now, the number 3 slot here is a little bit interesting. I actually don't know if it's going to be Michael Gallup or Trey Tucker. I know they brought Gallup in, and it should be him, but Trey Tucker looked okay when they gave him opportunities last season. And I was a bit surprised by that because I think he was being brought in as mainly a special teams guy, but he kind of started to take over from Hunter Renfrow and he looked solid. The fact that they didn't feel the need to bring in someone better than Gallup is a really good sign because Gallup couldn't even beat out Jalen Tolbert last year as a clear number 3 receiver at Dallas. So I expect that he's going to struggle a little bit in this situation. I think probably my best guess is that they play about 40 to 50% of snaps each, but I'm hoping that over time Trey Tucker takes over. I'm just not really expecting it to happen. I think there's a little bit of upside there. I also think it's possible that Gallup finally turns back into that receiver that he was 3 or 4 years ago before the injuries hit. I just don't think either of those things are particularly likely. I basically don't want anyone but Devontae Adams in this wide receiver room. I do, however, want their tight end because I'm a big Brock Bowers fan. I've talked about this a heap. He is one of my favorite tight ends in the league. He is going to be outstanding. If you didn't already, go and look at my hit rate videos where I talked about tight end success rates. Tight ends drafted in the top 16 picks always hit. Well, they have always in the past. We can't say they're always going to in the future, but certainly in the last 20 years, every single one of them has at least one top 5 fantasy finish and has been fantasy relevant for at least 5 years. That's a really good hit rate. You are expecting Brock Bowers to give you good fantasy production, and he'll probably do it out of the gate. It is a little bit hard to rely on tight ends to be productive straight away. That's not typically something that's happened, but when you're mainly a receiving tight end, you don't need to learn as much of the blocking stuff to get on the field. That is really going to help. I expect probably that early in the season, we see a little bit more of Michael Mayer. And I think we probably also see some Brian or Gentry as coming in as mainly blocking guys just to kind of help Bowers ease into that side of the role. But I think he immediately becomes one of their main receiving options. I think he probably spends some time as the big slot guy. I think he spends some time as not so much an inline guy, but certainly in the tight end position, but then going out and moving around and getting a lot of touches down the seam and out wide as well. He can play everywhere. He's a massive mismatch weapon. He's going to be excellent in the red zone. He is going to give you fantasy production. If you want someone on the Raiders, and I don't know why you would, but if you decided that you want someone on the Raiders because you're a Raiders fan or just a masochist, then definitely go out and get Brock Bowers because he is actually going to give you good production out of the gate and in the long term. I'm expecting 10 years of fantastic fantasy production out of Bowers. Now, there's a fair question. Well, what do we make of Michael Mayer? Michael Mayer was a good, solid second-round pick last year. There were a lot of people who thought he was going to be the first pick and thought he was going to be the best tight end. Now, it didn't turn out that way, but that talent hasn't gone anywhere. He was a little bit disappointing, but realistically, it's not like Austin Hooper was great anyway. This team just doesn't really seem to get it right with tight ends at the moment from a blocking perspective and the usage perspective, but we know they've been able to do it in the past. Darren Waller's been successful here in the past. There's no reason to believe that this team can't use tight ends effectively. I'm hoping that Bowers will be the receiving tight end, but I still think Mayer has a future in this league. I think he's going to be a solid player. It just might not be in Vegas. I still think he'll get some solid touches. It wouldn't surprise me if he ends up finishing as a top 30 tight end, but I'm thinking long-term with here. That's why I've got him ranked pretty high in Dynasty. I think within 3 or 4 years, he's going to be a starting tight end somewhere. It's just going to be a little bit of a rocky road. So that's very much a long-term perspective pick in my mind anyway. Now, let's move into the last team in this division, and it's the one that's made the most changes. It's the Los Angeles Chargers.
Jim Harbaugh, it is official. He is now the new head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers.
Justin Herbert going deep. He's looking for Palmer. He's got the ball, and that's the ball game.
On a kick. Dobbins got a running lane. Touchdown.
Edwards to the end zone. Touchdown.
In the 2024 NFL Draft, the Chargers select Ladd McConkey.
Who's got it better than us?
Nobody.
So, what do we expect from Jim Harbaugh in his first couple of seasons? Well, we know he's a winner and he'll do anything it takes to win. He tends to have a very run-heavy approach with low volume, focusing on trench warfare and a really good defense. Now, the Chargers don't have a good defense at the moment. They have a bottom 10 defense, but they also didn't even have a top 20 scoring offense. So they really need to rebuild and get the right pieces in place. They basically have Justin Herbert and some good defensive pieces, but it's probably going to take a couple of years before this really becomes a strong offense. I think this is going to be a little bit of an ugly situation where he ends up with 6, 7, 8 wins in the first season or two, and they slowly build into a little bit more of a juggernaut, because at the moment, the pieces they have, they don't inspire a lot of confidence. Look at the guys they're losing and then recognize how many points they scored last year with those guys, and that should give you an idea of what to expect this year. They also bring in Greg Roman from Baltimore a couple of years ago at Baltimore, and we know what to expect from him. And he's shown his hand already. He's brought in a couple of Baltimore running backs who are going to play in that same system. They're going to run the ball and run it heavy. We're going to expect a lot of early down touches from J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards and some safe passing out of Justin Herbert. I think Herbert probably needs that because he was a little bit disappointing last year. They don't have the same receiving back quality in Austin Eckler this year, which is going to make things tough. They don't have the wide receivers in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, and they have a very high amount of dead cap space because of Allen and Williams still being on their books for a lot of their contracts. Plus, they're paying J.C. Jackson $20 million a year to not pay for them this year. So I think it's going to take a couple of years for them to get that reset. They've got a heap of cap space. They've got a very young roster. I think in a couple of years, this could be a very strong team. It's just not going to happen quite yet. It's going to take a couple of years for them to rebuild, and I'm all for it. I think that's a sensible idea. The Chargers went out and got their guy. Jim Harbaugh goes into a situation where he's got a good, reasonably young quarterback who he can rebuild with. We know he's willing to try different things, but I think early we're going to see him keep it pretty simple, and the fact that he hired Greg Roman should really signal to you what they're planning on doing with this offense. Now, Justin Herbert's clearly the number one here, and I've got him ranked pretty low at 15. And I say he's ranked pretty low, but realistically, even when they've been very pass-heavy in the last few years, and if you look back at their pass percentage, I mean, they're the 6th highest passing percentage team and the 7th highest plays per game last season. That's not happening this season. And even with that, Herbert struggled to even be a top 12 quarterback. They're now going to really dial it back. They're going to keep the passing a whole lot simpler because he has struggled in the short range, although for some reason the numbers I've got there aren't working properly for some reason. There's some extra 8s in there. But he's going to keep it really safe, a lot of short to mid-range passing, a lot of running the ball, and very low play counts. None of those things are good for fantasy. You'll still get some passing touchdowns from him. There'll still be the occasional big play when teams really start to stack the box. But I think realistically from Herbert, you're going to see mediocre running production from him. You're going to see average passing touchdown totals from him. You're going to see average passing yardage. They're going to, I guess, waste his talent a little bit for a year or two until they can really get the system in place, get the defense right, and they're just going to go out and try to win games. They don't care about the fact that he's a fantasy asset. They're not going to use him that way. Their focus is entirely on winning games, having a strong defense, a good run game, and then they can pass the ball off that. All of those things are terrible for fantasy. You don't want any part of that. So I'm selling Justin Herbert high on the remaining shares that I already have. Now, the run game is where things get really interesting. I think this is probably where the value is. A lot of people are super excited by Kamani Vidal, but realistically, I think this is probably Gus Edwards and maybe J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins is a bit of a risk because he's coming off some serious injuries. He realistically hasn't been healthy since 2020, and a lot has happened since then. We all know that. Is he going to be able to consistently play? Well, I'm hoping so because he has plenty of talent, but I think mainly this is going to be Gus Edwards' backfield initially. I think it's going to be a committee, but Edwards is going to take most of the early down heavy lifting work, and they'll try to bring in Dobbins. And it wouldn't surprise me if halfway through the season, Dobbins becomes the number one guy. For now, though, it's Gus Edwards, and both of these guys are probably going to be pretty darn productive for fantasy. Now, I know it's exciting and interesting to go and look at a new name. Kamani Vidal is a new name. He's a 6th-round pick. He's a deserved 6th-round pick, and they don't have the greatest hit rate in the NFL. He's probably got a better chance than most of the other 6th, 7th-round guys in this draft, but I'm not particularly excited by him. I know there's going to be touches here, but if he's getting plenty of touches, it's in a committee. It's not as a clear number one guy. I can't imagine a situation where you're really going to be able to rely on him because his role just looks like it's going to be so similar to Edwards and Dobbins. I don't even know who's going to be their passing down back in this situation. I don't even know if they're going to have one. I think realistically, they're just going to run the ball a heap and then check down to their slot guys and tight ends if they need to do something along those lines. This is going to be a really awkward situation, this offense, but I think the run game's going to be the one part you can take an interest in. I think Edwards and Dobbins are guys you can get very late in drafts, especially if you've been taking a zero RB approach and you need someone to make it work. I think in redraft leagues, these guys are going to be perfect zero RB guys. I think in Dynasty, especially if you're trying to rebuild or if you have been rebuilding, you haven't really got the running backs yet, these are running backs that you can rely on to give you solid yardage, assuming that Dobbins is actually seeing the field in his case and assuming that Edwards keeps that lead role in his case. Now, the wide receiver room's interesting because there's plenty of talented players there. They're just kind of mid-range, average, talented players. And I think it's probably going to be a little bit ugly how the snaps end up working out. I think we can all agree that Ladd McConkey is probably the number one guy here. I don't know how long that's going to last for. He doesn't really profile as a typical number one guy. He profiles as, I think, Hunter Renfrow when he was the wide receiver 13 one year. They just kept checking down to their slot guy. And they needed to keep doing that because that's what was available to him. I think that's probably what this offense is going to look like for the first season or two. It won't be McConkey making amazing big plays. We did see that a fair bit from him last season, but that's mainly because that offense he was in was able to create big plays with a really strong run game and open up a lot of space for him. They were just dominating teams, so he was able to get really efficient touches. That's not going to happen here. They're going to be behind in a lot of games or playing grinding games. That's not a situation you want to particularly be in for fantasy if you can't get volume. Luckily, I expect he'll get plenty of volume. So in PPR, he's a good, solid option, but I think he lacks the upside of your Keon Coleman's, Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy. All of these guys can turn into true elite number one fantasy options. I don't think that's going to be in Ladd McConkey's wheelhouse. I think he's going to be the kind of guy that we think of as being a solid wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 style player for fantasy. Now, Joshua Palmer is going to be technically their number one guy. I expect he probably starts the year getting a lot more snaps, but I don't think he's going to get the touches that those snaps represent. He's always going to be that number 2 or 3 guy in his team. And in fantasy, that's just not that valuable. I just don't think they're going to air it out enough to make him productive. Even though McConkey had lower snap percentage last year and Palmer spent a surprising amount of time in the slot, I do expect that McConkey is probably going to be the slot guy. That's what we're hearing out of the Chargers at the moment. I think that Palmer spends his time outside opposite either Quentin Johnston or DJ Chark. I expect Johnston and Chark are probably in a little bit of a committee where Johnston's being that kind of big-bodied guy. He does have separation issues, and Chark's just getting deep basically and trying to take the lid off the offense a little bit. That's not going to be a particularly productive role. It hasn't been for him in the past. It probably won't be this year. I'm a little bit interested in Johnston because he is a talented player who was a first-round pick, who was underused and poorly used last year behind 2 really talented players, mostly one because Williams was injured a lot. I think the talent is there. We just haven't really seen him use it. I think the biggest risk with him is he ends up being a bust because it turns out that he's simply not able to separate from NFL quarterbacks. I also don't want anyone below these guys on the roster. I know a lot of people are interested in Brendan Rice and Cornelius Johnson. Those are 7th-round guys. Do you know how many of the last 100 6th and 7th round guys have been fantasy relevant? 2. We're talking Russell Gage and Noah Brown. Yeah, it's pretty ugly. So I'm not particularly interested in Brendan Rice or Cornelius Johnson. I know that they're trendy late round picks, and I was kind of excited about Rice initially because I do like the talent, plus he's a Rice. But I think after looking at that analysis, I've dropped him down a long way. I'm not interested in taking him on, except in the deepest of leagues, especially because there's so much depth on this depth chart. Now, the tight end room is particularly ugly. Hayden Hurst has produced at times in the past. He's just really struggled to stay healthy. And it's hard to look good realistically in that offense he was in. I think moving to the Chargers will help him a little bit. I think he's probably the number one guy, but it's going to be a committee situation. They will use Will Dissly. They paid Will Dissly a surprisingly high amount of money for a guy who's ultimately a blocking tight end. He just does that job really well. We saw him do it with the Seahawks as well. That's who Will Dissly is. He's going to be a solid producer as a blocking tight end. They're no longer going to try to use him as a receiving tight end. I think all teams have realized that's not his best role. They're going to use Hurst as the receiving guy. Parham will be the backup who has some upside, but he's also struggled to stay healthy. So one of those 2 guys is going to be the receiving back. How productive they'll be? Well, it's probably going to look like Gerald Everett did last year. We're talking, tight end 20 to 25 sort of range, whichever of those guys ends up winning that role. There's also a chance he'll just end up being a committee and they'll both be ultimately really disappointing. This isn't a tight end room you particularly want any part of. There's a surprising amount of these situations this year. We've already talked about the Chargers and Broncos, rooms where you just don't want any of the tight ends because there's no clear lead role. I think we might see the same thing with Cincinnati, for example. So getting those top guys, those Brock Bowers style guys, is pretty valuable, even though there's quite a few of them around. Now, that's all we've got for the AFC West. And heck, that's all we've got for the AFC. Next time, in a couple of days' time, I'll be back talking more NFC teams. We're starting things off with the NFC East, and there's heaps of fantasy guys to talk about there. So make sure you hang around. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you check out our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. My hair is going nuts here. Holy moly, what is going on? Check out our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. Obviously, check out our other stuff on YouTube. I also do some stuff over on Razzball on YouTube and our website. Our Instagram is at the Fantasy First Down, and our Twitter is at Fantasy First Down with no O. I answer all of your questions over there. I hope you'll hang around and check those out. But for now, I'll catch you later.